We're out here at Dacoma, Oklahoma, and we just got done with our field tour out here, looking at these sorghum plots, talking a lot about sorghum production here in Oklahoma, and what a successful event we had. Getting folks out of the turn row, getting folks out of this cut area, actually into the plots, looking through the plots was a very good success, and I think we're very positive response from a lot of growers out here. What did I talk about? A lot about the variety trial, and we talk a lot about just the individual varieties. Today we talked about what we're actually seeing out here in the field. We've had a great year out here at Dacoma. However, the last several weeks have gotten hotter and hotter, and we've gotten while we have gotten some rain, we are still fairly dry out here, and the sorghum's taking the effect of that. We talked about things like head spacing, whether we have a very compact head or whether we have a spread out head. You know, that more compact head, what we have issues with a lot of times is when we have head-borne insects. So we're talking headworms, maybe some sorghum aphids at the end of the year. It's really difficult with a very compact head to get chemical down in there to get a successful control. However, a head that's really spread out can actually lean over quite a bit and provide a good perching condition for a lot of our birds, which then can be a pest later on in the year. So talking a little bit about the value of the semi-compact head and seeing how those heads kind of set in these conditions is very valuable. We also talked a little bit about maturity. It's probably one of the most discussed points in grain sorghum is what's the best maturity. Based on our information we've gathered over the last several years, not the highest yielding year in, year out, but the most consistent maturity have been somewhere between 58 and 65 days to mid-bloom when we plant on time. The later we plant, the more narrow that window gets, and the earlier we get to where we can pick up on our later planted or even our double crop. We pick up more of those 50s, and we're maybe looking more like 56 days until about 62 days. So that window does get a lot more narrow and it shifts a little bit earlier. That's because we are wanting to get as much vegetation out there and processed as possible before we start moving into reproduction. And sometimes those later varieties just aren't able to get the vegetation and finish at the end of the year. And so based on what we've looked at in some of our data over the last couple of years is that we do spread out quite a bit. So variety does matter. While we're only looking at maybe 2 to 3 days at mid-bloom between our maturities, that can often relate to 7 to 14 days at harvest. So the difference between our 58 day to mid-bloom and our 67 day to mid-bloom, while it's only a couple of days at mid-bloom, it was multiple weeks at harvest. So we got to really look at that. When do we want to harvest and kind of pair that out, because it does make a big difference. We also talked a lot about head exertion out here. This is one thing we can see here about this variety in front of us. We do have, because of a lot of factors, but this year I think a lot of it's to do with heat, that we're not exerting this head really well out of the canopy to where we can get our harvest efficiency increased by allowing that to process less of this vegetation. The other thing is to look at tiller height. Some of these later tillers are staying fairly short. We see this tiller right down here is a lot shorter than what we have as this main stem here. So when we come to harvest, if this was a tiller we wanted to capture as part of yield, we have to decide, are we just going to go all the way down and process all of this plant material through the combine, or are we just going to forego harvesting some of these tillers and only get the main stem? If we had a more even distribution of tillers to where our tiller height matched more along our main stem height, we were able to get that in a more consistent pattern throughout the field. And that's when not only does our yield typically go up, but our harvest efficiency goes up. The last thing we kind of talked about when we talk about varieties is scouting for pests. It's a big year for pests out in the sorghum patch. We are seeing some sorghum aphids, and those can be very difficult. We're talking about 100 per plant on about 50 to 30% of our plants. So we are talking about a relatively low number of aphids when we want to make those applications. And so going through and asking producers or asking consultants to go through and sift through all of these leaves across several acres of a field is a trying task, and we might not be very successful at finding them. So what we are doing, especially at lower populations, we're also scouting for those auxiliary things that are out there with the aphids. So we're talking about things that are consuming the honeydew, ants, bees, flies, or we're scouting for our beneficial pests. So we're scouting for the lady beetle larvae and maybe some of the lacewing. We had quite a bit of look through here. We were finding some beneficials, and then right around that area we found the beneficials. We were able to find some sorghum aphid out there. So we don't want to make applications based on honeydew, based on beneficials, based on those axillary indicators, but they can help us identify where those populations are in the field and allow us to get a better handle on the populations and how much we actively have out there across several acres. The other thing we have this year is headworms. And it's one of those things that we often have headworms in really good years. And to go out right now, our headworms are really small. We're talking 1 to 2 instar. So we're talking about worms that are really small. So going through here in a hotter part of the day and just trying to pull apart these to scout for headworms is very challenging. We're often not going to find them, or they're just going to, forego our look because they're buried deep down within this head. Looking at what we call frass or that feeding of the insect is a big deal to, again, isolate where those insects might be. In addition, getting a nice clean bucket and going through a couple of fields or a couple of plants in a row and kind of beating that head a little bit into this bucket kind of gets you a really good indication of what's out there. We see we didn't get anything this time, and that's a good thing, but that's a really good way to quickly scout a lot of these heads for our head feeding insects like our sorghum headworm. We have a lot of products because we do have some aphid presence in the county, in the region, even in this field. Even though we are looking at relatively small worms, again, if we put a pyrethroid out there, we might be saving money on controlling those really young worms because we can be quite successful, but we might kill all our beneficials that I do believe are doing a lot of work controlling that aphid population in this field. So we do want to go ahead and switch to something that's more targeted, that is just going to be getting those worms in the heads if you do have a sprayable amount to where we're not killing all those beneficials and maybe spiking those headworm activity. So that's kind of what we talked about when we looked at a lot of the varieties, some varietal characteristics, some maturity characteristics that are going to supersede how an individual variety does one year, but looking at how some of those physiological and those phenotypical characteristics kind of display themselves out in these conditions, and then talking a whole lot about once we have a good looking crop like this, the one thing we don't want to do is lose it to a pest. So let's get out here, let's scout these acres, and we talked a lot about getting across a lot of acres and scouting them pretty quickly. And I think it's been very successful out here, getting folks out, having them scout themselves and make those recommendations based on what they saw in the field.